rather than memorize all the symbols in the IPAchart, I'd like to show you how to read it. And to do that, first we need to know a little bit about the vocal tract. Most speech sounds are produced by pushing air up out of the lungs, which is called egressive, and through the vocal tract, which includes the glottis, which is that opening between the vocal cords, the larynx, which houses the vocal cords, the pharynx, the oral cavity called the mouth, as well as the nasal cavity. Different speech sounds are made by changing the shape of the vocal tract from the vocal cords to the lips. And the majority of these speech sounds in all languages are produced in the mouth or the oral cavity. Here's a larger image of the vocal tract. And we'll be talking about these different features inside the oral cavity that enable speech to be produced. Just a word on the vocal cords. They're actually flaps of tissue housed inside of the larynx, also called the voice box. Your Adam's apple is actually a shield of cartilage that protects your larynx. Two major divisions of the IPA are consonants and vowels, and that's because the way that these are produced are a bit different. Consonants are produced when the air pulses, or the airstream as it's called, become more restricted or modified by the vocal tract. Vowels, on the other hand, are produced with relatively little restriction or modification of the airstream inside the vocal tract. So for our purposes, we don't have to look at the full-blown IPAchart. Instead, we'll look at the IPAchart with just the English consonants. The IPA organizes sounds based on just three characteristics. One is called voicing, and that's basically whether the vocal cords are vibrating or not. The second is called the place of articulation, and this is just where in the vocal tract is the restriction of the airstream taking place. And finally, the manner of articulation. How is the restriction of the airstream taking place? Is the airstream totally stopped, or is it just restricted a little? Voicing is really easy to understand. Voiced sounds are made when the vocal cords are narrow and vibrating, as in the sounds v and th. Voiceless sounds, on the other hand, are made when the vocal cords are apart and the air flows smoothly through, as in f, the f sound as in fine, or the th sound as in thigh. And as you can see on the chart, voiced sounds are shown in white, where voiceless sounds are shown in gray. And here's just a quick look at voiceless sounds versus voiced sounds. So the p in pat is voiceless, and the b in bat is voiced. And you can always determine pretty easily whether a sound is voiced or not by simply putting your hand on your throat near your larynx, and if it's voiced, you'll feel a kind of a vibration there. If it's voiceless, you won't feel that same vibration. Place of articulation is also straightforward. Where in the vocal tract is the restriction being made? The greatest variety of changes in the airstream occur in the mouth, the oral cavity. Knowing the parts of the mouth is also not too difficult. Some important locations in your mouth include things like the lips, right? We call those labials, the teeth or dentals, alveolar ridge, that bony ridge right behind your teeth, the hard palate. The hard palate is just behind that bony ridge. The soft palate, or the velum, which is that softer area behind the hard palate. And then finally, the glottis is the opening between the vocal cords. And so you can see, here's the place of articulation, and here's the descriptor. So they're not too hard to figure out. Teeth is dental, for example. Another thing that makes it easy is that the IPAchart is organized such that the very front part of the vocal tract, the lips, are over here, and the furthest part of your vocal tract, the glottis, is over here. So it's kind of like a head facing to the left. So for example, a bilabial. So bilabial sounds are produced by bringing the lips together, as in b, p, and m. Labiodentals, right, involve the lips and the teeth. So these are produced with the lower lip and the upper teeth, as in f and v. Interdental just means between the teeth. So these sounds are produced with the tip of the tongue between the teeth or just behind the teeth. Thigh is one and thy is another. These are actually kind of weird sounds and actually pretty rare sounds when you look at the world's languages. And people will often, who are not native English speakers, will often substitute some other sound for th or th, like the D sound. So instead of saying there, they might say dare. Alveolar sounds involve the tip of the tongue being on the alveolar ridge, or that bony ridge right behind your teeth, as you can see here. So these sounds, there's a lot of these sounds, like t, d, n, l, s, and z. Right? So the s and z sounds, they don't quite hit the alveolar ridge, but they come close. And then there's sort of intermediate sounds like alveopalatal, where the tongue is at or near the hard palate. These symbols are a little bit weird, right? So far they haven't been too bad. So this symbol is the sh sound, as in show. This one is the zh sound, as in garage. This is a combination of two sounds, the t and the sh, to make ch, as in chain. And here's another combination, a d and a zh, to make j. Velar sounds evolve the soft palate further back in your mouth. And this is where the tongue is at, or at least near the soft palate or the velum. So if you say the word king, or k, or g, as in go, then you can feel that articulation or that touching of the velum in your tongue. Also, here's a kind of unusual symbol in the IPAchart. It's the ng sound, right? The ng sound. And finally, we have the glottal. And this is produced at the larynx. So typically, you have what's called a glottal stop, where you cut off the air at your larynx, so your vocal cords are totally closed and no air is going through. We have some glottal stops in English when we say oh or those involve a stoppage of air. So if you say and stop, you're not breathing because there's no air getting through your vocal cords. So the gecko will say bottle, right? So those two T's are actually not pronounced as a T, but as a glottal stop. Or sometimes people say kitten or button. Those are also glottal stops. Or even something like fountain. And we have more subtle glottal stops. If you say something like, are you certain you want one? Can you hear the glottal stops there? Certain you want one? More dramatically would be a kind of Cockney accent where glottal stops are really pronounced. So Betty bought a bit of butter would be a huge exaggeration of a glottal stop. But the bit of butter Betty bought was bitter, so Betty bought another bit of butter. Okay, I think you get the idea. So finally, we've talked about voicing, we've talked about the place of articulation, right? Where in the vocal tract the restriction of the airstream is taking place. And now I'll talk about the manner of articulation, or how the airstream is modified as it moves through the vocal tract. Stops, as in the glottal stop, are when the airstream is totally stopped and then released, as in p or b or o. Stops are distinctive in that they are maintained for a very short amount of time, basically because you're not breathing. And you can't stretch that out no matter how hard you try, as in t. Fricatives, as you can see here on the chart, are when the airstream is forced to pass through a fairly narrow space such that it develops an audible friction, right? So it's a fricative. These, unlike stops, can persist forever, at least theoretically, until you run out of breath. So compare t, a stop, with s, which is a fricative. And sometimes you can merge a stop and a fricative together to get something called an affricate or affricate, which start as a stop and end as a fricative. So ch, as in church, is just an example, is a good example of an affricate. It starts with a T sound and then turns into the sh sound and then releases. Another sort of more unusual type of manner of articulation is something called a nasal, and this involves lowering the soft palate or the velum so that the air goes out the nose, as in in mother and in next. Kind of counterintuitively, when you have a cold, you actually cannot produce a nasal. So when people say, "Oh, you sound so nasal, you have a cold," that's not actually true. You sound more oral because the air can't actually flow through your nose. And so when that happens, there's a substitution. So you could say, "How come I sound so funny?" when you have a cold, and it's because you can't produce the M and N sounds, and they get substituted for very similar sounds in the IPAchart. So you can see the M is being substituted with the B because it's a very similar sound in terms of the place of articulation, and the N is substituted with a D because it's also a very similar sound in terms of the place of articulation. So the bottom part of the IPAchart that we're using involves consonants that are less distinct than, say, stops. And these include something called an approximant. They involve only a minimal amount of restriction of the airstream. So r and l are two good examples, and especially with r, there's a number of different ways that we pronounce r, even though we have a single symbol that represents all those sounds. At the other end of the continuum are the semivowels or the glides, and these are the wh and w and y sounds. So these are called semivowels because they're more like vowels, or they're somewhere intermediate between vowels and consonants. These two symbols represent two different sounds that we have for basically W. So you can say wheatins or wheatins, as we learned from a popular commercial based on a television show.